across a millennium. From roughly the early 2nd millennium CE into the dawn of the modern era, Africa held centers of wealth, learning, and architectural accomplishment that were for long stretches little known outside their regions. These places, cities, libraries, palaces, and ritual sites, were woven into networks of trade and belief that linked the Sahara to the Mediterranean, the Sahel to the Atlantic, and the interior to the Indian Ocean. When Europeans first mapped these regions in any systematic way, they often misread what they found, or assumed that true complexity lay elsewhere. As a result, much of Africa's material and intellectual heritage passed from prominence into partial obscurity, for reasons that were local as often as they were global. For the purposes of this hour, we will follow several clear, documented threads of that hidden past. The manuscript libraries of Timbuktu in present-day Mali, the ruined city of Great Zimbabwe near modern Masvingo, the bustling island city of Kilwa Kisiwani off the coast of present-day Tanzania, and the ways in which these and other sites were lost, concealed, rediscovered, and ultimately reinterpreted. This is not a story of mystery for its own sake, but of craftsmanship, record-keeping, trade, and the fragile ways information survives when politics and climate shift. We will move slowly, and with care, through dates, places, and the human choices that determined which stories were kept and which were nearly forgotten. Long-distance trade and religious institutions were the twin engines that made many African centers remarkable. The trans-Saharan routes carried salt, gold, and manuscripts from the Sahel to North Africa. The Indian Ocean exchanges brought Chinese porcelain and Arabian glass to East African ports. Between these streams, local states flourished. In West Africa, the Mali Empire and later the Songhai state created literate cultures closely allied to Islam. A decisive moment came in 1324 when Mansa Musa, the Mali ruler, undertook his famous pilgrimage to Mecca. His journey made visible the wealth and scholarly links of West Africa, and drew scholars and students to cities such as Timbuktu. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Timbuktu's mosques, notably the institutions associated with Sankore, Jingareba, and Sidi Yahya, housed private and communal libraries that contained legal texts, Quranic commentaries, histories, and works of astronomy and mathematics. Far to the east, along the Swahili coast, cities like Kilwa Kisiwani flourished from the 10th through the 15th centuries. Kilwa controlled maritime trade in gold from the interior, ivory, and other commodities. Accounts from travelers of the medieval period, most famously Ibn Battuta in 1331, record cosmopolitan trading communities where merchants from Arabia, Persia, India, and Africa exchanged goods and ideas. To the south, on the high plateaus of southeastern Africa, Great Zimbabwe rose between approximately the 11th and 15th centuries as a political and economic center. Its monumental stone enclosures were the seat of rulers who controlled gold-producing hinterlands that supplied the coast. Archaeological finds, beads, Chinese ceramics, and metalwork attest to extensive links with the wider Indian Ocean world. When political turmoil arrived, whether through invasion, environmental stress, or shifting trade routes, the visible signs of these civilizations faded. Manuscripts were hidden in trunks and private archives. Towns were abandoned as power centers moved, and monumental stonework sat, for generations, under grass and wind. Later, from the 16th century onward, shifting global trade and European maritime expansion altered the calculus of wealth and memory across the continent, creating new histories and new silences. Our story begins in sequence with the city-states of the East African coast. Kilwa Kisiwani, an island off the current Tanzanian shore, became a major entrepot from the 10th century onward. Kilwa's merchants dealt in gold from the interior, gold that in turn often originated in the high plateaus associated centuries later with the site we call Great Zimbabwe. In 1331, the Moroccan traveller Ibn Battuta visited Kilwa and described its wealth and sophisticated social life. He noted stone houses, an ordered society of merchants, and a cosmopolitan court. Over time, Portuguese arrival in the Indian Ocean in the early 16th century, with a noted 1505 Portuguese naval expedition along the Swahili coast, altered Kilwa's fortunes. Trade patterns shifted, and some urban centres went into decline. With the decline came a gradual retreat from public prominence. Ornate ceramics and architectural complexes remained, but their significance faded for outside observers, until later archaeological work illuminated them again. Turning westward, let us move inland to the southern highlands. Great Zimbabwe, built of carefully placed granite blocks without mortar, stands as a testimony to centralized political organization and long-distance trade. Archaeologists date its primary occupation to roughly the 11th through the 15th centuries. Excavations and artifact studies show trade contacts with East Africa and beyond. Beads and imported ceramics testify to a connected world. Yet by the time European explorers reached the region in the 19th century, much of Great Zimbabwe was overgrown and its origins contested. Early European writers sometimes denied African agency, proposing foreign builders. These claims persisted until methodical archaeological investigations in the early 20th century corrected the record, demonstrating Great Zimbabwe's indigenous origins and complexity. Now we travel to the Sahel and to Timbuktu, a city that, from the 13th through the 16th centuries, became an intellectual hub in West Africa. The Mali Empire and later the Songhai Empire fostered learning. Manuscript cultures grew in private households, in the libraries attached to mosques, and within scholarly families. Collections covered law, theology, poetry, medicine, mathematics, and local chronicles. These were not mere copies of texts from elsewhere. They included locally produced scholarship that engaged Arabic intellectual traditions and West African contexts. The century 1591 marks a turning point. An invading force from the Saadi Sultanate of Morocco intervened in the affairs of the Songhai state, engaging in a military campaign that culminated near Gao and reconfigured power in the region. The disruption of that period contributed to the decline of centralized Songhai authority and altered long-distance trade. Yet the learned communities of Timbuktu continued to preserve manuscripts. Families and scholars hid codices, passing them down from generation to generation. Over centuries, these collections were kept in private custody, sometimes sequestered away in wooden chests or buried during times of danger. For periods measured in generations, much of Timbuktu's documentary heritage remained largely unavailable to outside scholars and to the broader public. Meanwhile, in the coastal Indian Ocean and inland trade networks, many other archives and monuments fell into comparative obscurity. When European explorers, missionaries, and colonial administrations began systematic mapping and collecting from the 18th into the 20th centuries, they often misunderstood what they had found. Sites like Great Zimbabwe were first recorded in European accounts in the later 19th century. Karl Mauck, a European prospector, reported on prehistoric stone ruins in 1871, sparking debate and eventual archaeological inquiry. It was not until methodical excavations in the early 20th century, notably those led by Gertrude Caton Thompson in 1929-1931, that the evidence for indigenous African construction at Great Zimbabwe was firmly established in academic literature. The cumulative effect of these processes, the ebb and flow of trade, the disruptions of conquest, climatic variation, and the biases of later observers, created pockets of history that were, for long spans, underappreciated or misinterpreted. Yet within those pockets, human agents worked deliberately to preserve memory. Scholars copying manuscripts, families protecting archives, and craft communities maintaining traditions of stonework and metalworking. Those acts of preservation, often private and modest, allowed these secrets to survive until a more global scholarly interest could reframe their stories. When historians examine why entire archives or monumental traditions became obscure, three interlocking causes frequently appear. First, political disruption. Invasions, dynastic collapse, and shifts in trade routes interrupt public patronage. The Moroccan campaign of 1591 and the later arrival of European maritime powers changed economic flows that had supported centers such as Timbuktu and Kilwa. Second, environmental and economic shifts. Variations in rainfall, the exhaustion of local resources, and the rerouting of commerce can depopulate cities and marginalize their cultural institutions. Third, intellectual and colonial bias. Early European observers sometimes denied or minimized African agency, misattributing monumental achievements and neglecting local records. Yet it is equally important to recognize the resilience of preservation practices within African societies. Manuscripts were copied, sometimes hidden. Oral traditions were formalized into chronicles. Stonework endured. The apparent loss of knowledge was not always total disappearance, but often a change in where and by whom knowledge was kept. This duality, loss and continuity, is central to understanding how secrets persisted for centuries and then re-emerged when circumstances allowed. The rediscovery and renewed study of these archives and ruins in the 19th and 20th centuries reshaped global understanding of Africa's past. The demonstration that Great Zimbabwe was a product of Southern African polities corrected a long-standing misreading of material culture. The scholarly attention to Timbuktu's manuscript collections revealed rich, indigenous intellectual traditions in West Africa that had long been underestimated. The consequences are not purely academic. These recoveries have contributed to modern cultural revival and political identity across the continent. Manuscripts and monuments became sources of pride and impetus for preservation projects. They also raised critical ethical questions about ownership, stewardship, and the role of foreign museums and archives. In recent decades, local communities, national governments, and international organizations have moved toward cataloging, digitizing, and protecting manuscript collections and archaeological sites. These efforts acknowledge that the secrets kept for centuries are living legacies, not static curiosities, and that their reintegration into contemporary cultural life requires sensitive, collaborative stewardship. As our slow journey through these hidden histories comes to a pause, consider this. The places that once receded from broad notice did not vanish so much as change custodians. Knowledge moved from public squares to private chests, from royal courts to family libraries. In the next segment of our documentary, we will listen more closely to the manuscripts themselves. We will open a few representative folios from Timbuktu, read the cadence of a West African legal text, and trace the marginal notes of scholars who argued across generations. We will also step into the storerooms and fieldwork of modern archaeologists to learn how fragments of pottery and a single bead can reweave a lost trading route into the map of our shared past. Rest for a moment and let the patience of these places sink in as we prepare to read their quiet testimony in the next chapter.